I think we had talked a little bit last time about what. Did we talk any about hosting? What kind of things you'd look for if you were going to go live? Okay, there was a lot of stuff that we didn't get to in the previous classes because I have a tendency to ramble, if you haven't noticed. And even though I have notes in front of me, I'm going to try and stick to them and not ramble this time. Um, DNS is the domain name system. So, can anyone tell me what a domain name is, for example? GoDaddy.com. Okay, yes. A domain name actually is that full thing. It ends with a what's called a top level domain of .com, .net, .org, or nowadays it's .cc, .tv, .xyz. Literally, there's an XYZ top level domain now. Don't ask me why. Um, but they keep adding more of those things. But the full domain name is whatever the first part is, GoDaddy dot, and then the extension that extension on the end is called the top level domain. Um, and so if you have a domain name, who has a domain name or has registered one for yourselves? Oh, most of you. Good, good. How many of you actually have one for yourself and not for like a client? Okay, good, cool. We're going to be talking a little bit about that, and then later on, um, I'm hoping that what you guys can do for homework, if you don't already have a domain name, or if you've never registered one, whether for yourself or for a client, you can go through the process of searching for a domain name and getting one, registering it. You don't have to worry about setting up hosting if you don't want to do all that right now. But I would like you guys to have the experience of looking for a domain name, being disappointed that all the good ones are taken, and having to settle for one that is sort of subpar or that is like your full name with your middle name spelled out because all the other variations of it are taken. So, how does the domain name system work? The domain name system is it's kind of like the phone book for the internet. Does anybody remember the phone book? Anybody actually still get it delivered? Well, I'm sorry. Let's back up then. The domain name system is more like the contacts list in your phone. Uh, if you have all of those people named Aaron in your contacts list, you probably don't remember their phone number, but you just tap on their name and it translates it for you into 8675309, whatever. That should be Jenny, but this is the best screenshot I could find with the contacts list. And so if you look up a person's name in your contacts list, you don't have to remember their phone number. So it's the same thing with the DNS. Option8.com, which is my domain name for my business, translates into a number. And if you can memorize that number just in the short time that you look at it, then congratulations, you don't need to be in this class because you have the kind of brain that already knows HTML and probably was born with it. So if you are sitting at your computer and you want to go to my website, which if you insist on having the W's is www.option8.com. And there are some very friendly people there ready to send you a web page whenever you request it. But you don't know where that is because you don't know that number. So, uh-oh. So your computer, or your web browser really, talks to a computer at your ISP, which is usually overburdened and slow because everyone else on your ISP is using that same domain name server. So your web browser says you typed in option8.com. I don't know where that is. Where is it? So your ISP says I don't know where it is, and it talks to what's called the root servers or the root domain servers for the .com domain. So the top level domain .com is handled by a bunch of servers scattered throughout the world, managed by this organization we'll talk about later. And what your ISP talks to that server, or usually some intermediary between your ISP and the root servers, because otherwise they would get overtaxed all the time. But anyhow, this is the short, quick and sweet version of it. The root server says, let me look that up for you. I don't know where it is, but I know who does. And it says, go to this DNS server. This one is called, this is the domain server that I run called, in this case, ns for nameserver.option8llc.com, which is another domain that I run. And so your ISP says, hey, ns.option8llc.com, you are the domain name server that is supposed to know where option8.com is. Where is it? That domain name server says, oh, here it is. Here's that number. Finally, your ISP server sends it back to you and says, okay, here's the number for option8.com. That's the IP. Yeah, when I say the number, it's the IP number. Yeah. And so finally, after all of that, your computer can talk to my computer, and you can have a conversation. You can look at my website. That whole thing can sometimes take a few seconds if you've never actually, if you've never gone to the domain before. So that first time, it has to go and say, where is it? Who's in charge of it? Here's the number for it, and then it goes and talks to it. After that first transaction is over, it's all cached. So all the intermediaries have a cached version, a local version of that answer. So subsequent questions of where option8.com is will go straight to the source and then back again, and it'll be fairly instantaneous, again, depending on how busy that server is. But all that is to say, where is that server? But who's in charge of all that? Do you get to do that? Do you get to decide where my server is and what the number is? No. You have control over your domain name, but in order to actually host it somewhere, you have to talk to a hosting provider, and they'll provide you with usually an IP number that's shared with a bunch of other domains, as well as the DNS server to refer to in that registration to say, here's my domain name, and here is the server that's in charge of knowing where it is at any given moment. So the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers is the corporation that assigns names and numbers to the internet. Is that circular enough for you? So they basically, what they do is they certify and regulate domain registrars, as well as being the ones that dole out the IP numbers to people that are hosting providers, infrastructure providers. They build and run the, well, ICANN doesn't build and run the routing stuff. They control who gets those IP numbers. So they'll have a giant block of IP numbers for AT&T and for IBM and for GoDaddy and all those other companies that are building out the infrastructure for the internet, and they are then assigned those, the GoDaddies of the world are assigned those numbers, and they'll send you one, or they'll put one of their servers at that number, and your website will go on that server and get assigned that number. In the beginning, back after the primordial ooze cooled and the internet crawled out onto the land for the first time, yes, there was one registrar. It was called Network Solutions. They were, I'm trying to remember who they actually were formed by, but they were the provider for registrations. They had a monopoly for a limited number of years. Their monopoly was extended a number of times because nobody else could figure out how to do it. And then eventually some other companies said, well, we'll figure out how to do it. Let us take over some of it. And so now there's a whole bunch of competition. You can get your domain name registered at Network Solutions, at places like register.com, at GoDaddy. A new one that's nice is Hover. There's a bunch of them run by Two Cows, which is a very strange Canadian company. But all of those will do the same thing. They'll check to see if any of the other registrars have a domain name that you want that's already registered by somebody else, and then they'll tell you, no, you can't have that one, choose a different one. Or they'll tell you, yes, you can have that domain name, pay us some money, and you'll be the owner of that registration. Usually it's an annual fee. It can be as low as a few dollars, depending on what you sign up for. Is all you want is that registration, or it can be considerably more if it's one that someone else has previously owned and it's in high demand. You can also get your website hosted by your registrar. I would recommend against it because the registrars are going to be um, basically providing just bare bones the least they can do hosting, because they can get you at that registration phase. Oh, sign up for email, sign up for web hosting. Um, and the um, the thing is, once they've got you, it's real easy to keep you. It's hard to transfer. Well, it's easier now than it used to be, but it's still kind of a Byzantine process to transfer from Network Solutions to GoDaddy, or get your domain name that you registered for a client in your name transferred to that client's name. But that's a whole different conversation for a whole different time. But so registrars, um, I personally prefer Network Solutions just because I've used them literally since the mid 90s to register domain names, and I have some that have been registered. Like my website, I registered in 1998, and I've been continuing to renew it. And their prices are probably the highest. Um, GoDaddy and Hover have pretty low prices. GoDaddy will try and sell you everything under the sun as soon as you log onto their website. Register.com is kind of in the middle. But so if you haven't registered a domain name before, I would start with like register.com, or Hover. I think it's hover.com, because their interface is pretty simple and they'll kind of walk you through the process without trying to give you a whole bunch of other add-ons. If you do it the other way, if you want to go ahead and set up the hosting first, if you're ready to set up hosting, a lot of the hosts will essentially do the registration for you, and they'll contract through. They may contract through GoDaddy. They may contract through one of the others, like Two Cows or something like that. And it's a fairly transparent process for you. And what they're doing is they're registering so many domains that they get a discount. They get a kind of a bulk discount, so they can mark it up and add it to your hosting price for next to nothing, and it doesn't cost them much at all to do the registration. That's one way to go if you are ready to go ahead and set up hosting and you don't have the domain yet. But if you're doing the process of building a website, especially for yourself or for a client, you may not be ready to host it. You may not even be ready to think about how big the site is, or how much space you're going to need, or how much bandwidth you're going to need. But one of those first things in that process of discovery and research is finding a domain name, registering it. Do they have an existing domain name? Do they need to transfer it to something that you can make the DNS changes, that kind of thing? So the reality is, most of the time, if you're building a site, you start with that domain name, if they don't already have one, and get it secured and registered first, and then you worry about hosting closer to the end, because your requirements may change in the middle. So you may need to actually get a host that does ASP if you have an ASP programmer, versus WordPress if you're doing a WordPress CMS, that kind of stuff. So I've already mentioned this, but your homework, at some point, I'd like you, if you haven't already, register a domain name. For yourself, for the projects for this class, for a portfolio, even if it's just an About Me page where you post your resume, something that if you don't already have a website, and part of the reason that you're in this class is that you want to learn a little bit more how to do your own website or for clients, go ahead and register one. It can be anything you want. And don't worry about hosting. Don't set up anything like email. Just get it registered, and like I said, go through the process of finding a domain that you like, see how much it's going to be, and that'll be yours for however long you want to keep it registered. But anyhow, once you do get hosting set up, they're going to give you some critical pieces of information for setting up your website. One of them is going to be an FTP password, or sometimes it'll be an SFTP, and the S meaning secure in one way or another. You might get something like a login for a control panel, something like Plesk or cPanel. Those are ways that you can log in. It's an interface so you can generally log in and see adding email addresses to your server, or turning on WordPress, checking your quotas, how much room you're taking up on the server, that sort of thing. The all of those are going to be a little bit different depending on, again, which provider you use, or you can skip it all and just use what's baseline already installed and just go straight to putting your files on the server. So what you'll get is an FTP username and password, and FTP is the file transfer protocol. That is the protocol by which we transfer files over the internet. It's how you transfer the files. And sometimes, like I said, it'll be secured in one way or another. FTP is one of the really old parts of the internet, and it'll be made obsolete. Thank you. It'll be obsoleted by some more secure protocols eventually, but because it's really quite open and unsecure, you'll see various secure versions of it. But in essence, you'll get a username and a password, and to get into your site, you'll use an FTP client, and this is the interface for the FTP client part of Coda, which is a good example because it's basically a file listing of your local files and your remote files. And most of the FTP clients that you're going to use are going to have that very same kind of interface. Two panes, one for your local files and one for your remote files. So here's Filezilla, which is the one that I'm going to use for the demonstration. But what you'll do is you'll start with your files on your computer, and you will navigate to where your folder is that has all of your HTML files in it. And you can either click and drag them over to the remote server, or you can hit a publish button, or you can hit a synchronize button. There's various interfaces that all do the same thing. They take the files that are on your computer, push them up to the server. And in order to do that, you need to have your local files organized so that when they go onto the web server, you can actually hit them with a web browser, and the web browser will understand where things are, what the file names look like, that kind of thing. So this is what I'm going to call my local root folder. Okay, so here's my local site. That's my path to my local files. So here is my folder with all my stuff in it for the Constitution site that we did in class last time. So I've got my Article 1, style sheet, and then folder for my images, that sort of thing. So a quick note on organizational structure for your sites. I've talked before about making sure that if you come back to your website in 6 months or a year, you can find all your stuff. Or if you have to hand the site off to somebody else, they can find all the stuff. If you're doing an HTML site, you're not doing any sort of content management system, nothing's going to keep track of the paths for you. Keep it as simple as you can, nice and flat. So in this instance, all of my HTML files are right here in the root. And I'm going to keep using the word root, but that's the base folder. That's where all of the stuff starts. So that's going to be when you go to your website, the slash at the end of .com is the root of the site. So that's what I mean when I'm saying root. So all of my HTML files are here in the root. And then I've got a folder for images, one for JavaScript if there's JavaScript for your site, one for audio, for video, and then one for downloads and miscellaneous documents. That way, the root of the site stays fairly clean, and you can say, okay, I'm looking at this page on my website. The HTML is here. It's getting all of its images from the images folder. If there are scripts on the page, they're coming from this JavaScript folder. If there's a video referenced by the page, or a PDF or a form for people to download, it's going to be in this downloads folder. There's no questions about Well, is that going to be in assets? Is it going to be in media? Is it going to be in included files? Just keep it as simple as you can. This is the structure that I like. People have, best practices, and they've built their own stuff up from years of experience in different ways. But this is the one that I like. Even when I'm doing a fairly big uh, site that has even up to 100 HTML files or even more if there's a bunch of little bits and bobs. Um, I might break it down into all of the news or all of the articles go into an articles folder or something like that. But for the most part, when you're doing a basic site, this is how I would recommend doing it, and then you can kind of branch off from there. If you have high res images and thumbnail images, you can add them inside the images folder, just so you know I'm going to be getting a thumbnail image, so I go to images and then thumbnails, that sort of thing. Everybody sort of understand the general gist? Okay. So my folder over here on aigaweb101.com/cmangan doesn't have anything in it right now. So I'm going to take this article1.html and drag it over there. So now it has transferred over here. And that's how most of the FTP clients that you're going to use are going to work. Click on it, drag it over, or what you might get is a right click and upload. So right clicked on my file and it clicks on upload. In this case, it's asking me, do I want to overwrite it or skip it, and a whole bunch of other options in between. And there's Filezilla has a nice queue. You can add a bunch of things to the queue and then hit upload all, and then it'll just go through them all at once instead of doing them as you click on them. So it'll wait until you're done selecting which files you want, and then it'll queue them up. So how does that look when I go to my web browser? So the things that you're uploading into your folders are going to be aigaweb101.com / the name that you logged in as. So in my case, it's cmangan. So that / there, that is going to be the root of your directory on the aigaweb101.com site. So this is giving me a strange error. Forbidden. I don't have permission to access. Well, I just put something there, right? I just put my document there in the root of the folder, but I can't see it. Any ideas why? Yeah, I need the HTML file. Right? Yeah, it's not just, I can't just point to the folder and then get everything that's there. At least not these days. Most of the time, if you just go to a folder full of files, you have to have something there to show. Otherwise, it's going to give you this permissions error. So if I go to article, was it -1.html? There we go. So there's my HTML file, but I'm pretty sure I had the, what did I have with that to make it actually look right? Okay, I need the CSS file. Okay, so that's going to be in my styles.css. I'll upload that. And I think there were some images with it. So, oh yeah, that's right. There were some images in there, so I'll upload those as well. And then, so now I've got my files here. Article1.html should look fine, right? Here it goes. There's the CSS. Great. All these, all the CSS is working. That's fine. And I'll go down here, check that image. Where's my kitty cat? What happened to my kitty cat? Oh, it's not in the same folder. Okay. So what did I need to do over here? I'll just take this, grab that whole images folder and move it over. What I did was I created this images folder on the server, and now it has my images inside it. So I've got these guys here that are at the root. I'm going to go ahead and delete those. So here we go, and delete those from the server because I don't want them cluttering up my root folder. So if I refresh this page, there's my kitty cat. Okay. So HTML, the included CSS file, and the included images are now all in the same place on the server relative to one another as they were on my local version of the site. And that's the way you're going to want to keep it. So that way, what you can do is open up this file in, let's see if we can open it. Yeah, open up your local version of the file in Chrome or whatever your web browser is. Do all of your checking and testing and stuff. And then when you're done with it, upload it to the server and it should look exactly the same. As long as you keep your remote version of the site and your local version of the site the same, and you don't have your images, for instance, outside of their images folder, you don't have your names changed on the remote version different from the local version, then whatever you do testing wise to open this, to look at this file locally, so there's the local version, so here it's in my Dropbox, yada yada yada, it'll look exactly the same when you go to it on the server. The best way to do all that is just take everything in your local folder, you don't need this invisible file, and upload it. And in this case, we will just go ahead and overwrite, and so all of our stuff will go on there. Okay, now, so with the exception of this DS store file, which is an invisible file on the Mac, and you can ignore that, everything on the server now looks like it does on my local version. One thing you can do with a lot of FTP clients, or if you're using something like Dreamweaver or Coda that has an FTP client built into a developing interface, is actually edit the files on the server themselves. Anyhow, you'll be tempted to open the file on the server and make changes to it so that you don't have to worry, you don't have to go back and forth uploading your local file, checking it to make sure that it works, and back again and back again. But if you do that, you are likely to end up with a situation where you've got some changes that have been made on the remote version of the file, and then some changes that have been made in the local version of the file. And there the twain shall meet. One of them will be uploaded over top of the other one, and you'll lose some of your changes. Or you'll continue to make changes after you are done uploading something on your local copy, and it will get out of sync with your remote copy. And you will think, oh, but those changes are already in here, but they're not. And when you overwrite it, some of those changes will have been undone. So remember, always make sure that you're working on the latest version of the file. So if you make changes, or if someone else makes changes and uploads them, make sure that you have grabbed your files from the server, push them back down, or make sure that you make sure that you always make your edits in the same place, the same local folder, and then upload them when you're done and you're ready for them to be presented on the web. Is that clear enough? Yeah. It's the same kind of thing as if you're working on a print file and you make changes to, you have version 1 of the file, version 2 of the file, version 3 or whatever. If you went back to version 1 to make some change and then print out a PDF or whatever for to present it, and they like that change, you're gonna have to go back in and take that change and put it into version 3, but version 3 might have different copy because it's been changed since version 1. So always make sure you're working on the most recent version. And if you ever have any question, oh, did that thing that I'm looking at on the server change versus what I'm looking at on my local copy, just look at the, you can often look at the modification date. So all of these have 7:41 tonight as their modification time. And that's when they were uploaded. And if these were changed more recently than that, then these will be the newer ones. So this one, for instance, is Article 1. I haven't changed since the 13th. And the file on the server was uploaded at 7:45 tonight, or 7:44 tonight. If I made a change since then, I don't know. I'll just make sure that I grab it and just be on the safe side. So if I look at this site in my web browser, so click on Article 1, go to Article 2. It's all working because all this stuff is relative in the same place as it was on my local version, my local copy. But how about I get rid of this funkiness here, so I can just tell people, go to this location, and they don't have to worry about, is it article -1, is it constitution.html, .htm, or HTML? Any suggestions? Any question? Anybody know how to make that happen? Well, what we need is a default file, or a yeah, it's basically what we're looking at here is the directory listing for that folder on the server. And what we need is to have something be the default that loads whenever you look at that directory on the server. So you hit yada 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 / with no HTML file named there, and the default is going to be, for the most part, either index.html, if I can type it, index.html, or in some cases it might even be default.html. Most of the time it could be either one or the other. Whichever one is there gets to be the default file that loads. I like to just stick with index.html because I think that's the most common now. So if we go to Chrome and just refresh that page, this is our index.html file. What I did in Filezilla was I right-clicked on it and then renamed it. But what did I just tell you not to do? Uh-oh. Article 1's not there anymore. I made a change on the server, and now, well, okay, Article 1 is here. So now it's back over here again, but I've got all that content in index.html. So what I'm going to have to do is go into all of these files on in my local copy and change any reference to Article 1 to index.html. Because what I want is Article 1 to load as my default page, as my index page. Now I could have them both there, and that'd be fine. So anytime you click off of index.html, there's no references back to it. So you'll get article 1.html, and then you'll never get back to index.html unless you type it in. But then if I make changes to article 1, I'll also have to make changes to the index.html file. So as you're planning your website, be sure to have your main page be named index.html. And then from there you can name it however you want within reason, as long as it's alphanumeric, no spaces, no weird characters like quotes or ampersands, things like that. Keep it to letters, numbers, dashes, and dots, and you'll be safe. And the same thing for directories or folders. Letters, numbers, dashes, and dots. So if I were to rename this with a capital A instead of a lowercase a, what's going to happen is Chrome's not going to be able to find it. So a lot of things on the web are what's called case sensitive, or sorry, case insensitive, but in this case it is case sensitive, and your files and file names, as long as you are consistent, and if you capitalize it, it's always capitalized whenever you link to it, or if it's not capitalized, you don't capitalize it whenever you link to it, you'll be fine. So as far as file naming, file structure of your website, any questions about the rules, what you can and can't do, what you should and shouldn't do? As long as your HTML files end in .html, so that's the file extension, it'll load as an HTML file. If you're ever doing things as in PHP or any of the other sort of server-side scripting languages, you'll have to be consistent with how they get named as well. So they'll generally be by the file extension. So HTML files are .html. A PHP file is going to be a .php, and so on. If you get into that kind of thing, for the most part, you'll learn the rules and stick to whatever language it is will have that extension on it. Images, GIFs or GIFs, depending on how you want to keep it. .gif, JPEGs can be either JPEG or JPG. If you put the wrong extension on the end of a file, some browsers will get confused by it, some browsers won't, and then you'll look at it in Explorer or whatever and go, why didn't it worked just fine in Safari, but that file's not loading when I look at it in Chrome or Explorer. Again, some browsers will ignore the file name entirely and actually look at the file before it determines what kind of file it is. But as long as you are consistent and this JPEG is named .jpeg, it'll load as a JPEG. Same thing with audio files and video files. Generally, you're going to need some kind of plugin or something for those. So you're probably not going to run into the difference between an M4V and an MP4. But trust me, there is some weird difference between the two. They're both MPEG-4 files, but some plugins will like it better if an M4V is there instead of an MP4. Don't ask me why. This is the same kind of thing you'll run into if you have a PSD file and someone has named it JPEG. You try to open it in Photoshop and it blows up on you. Or if you have an MP3 file and your music player doesn't like it because it doesn't have the same extension MP3. It's typical file naming stuff. I just mention it because you may be tempted to have a file name that is a little bit more descriptive of the contents, but you'll want to keep it, again, letters, numbers, and dashes and dots just so that it's easier on the browser and doesn't have to interpret things like spaces and slashes and weird stuff, because systems are going to be a little different, and they're going to break differently when you break the rules.